"Please help me take this off," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. Jackal's calloused fingers brushed against the delicate pearl buttons of a torn wedding dress. The fabric, once pristine white, was now a map of dirt, blood, and terror. It clung to the woman's frame like a shroud, a beautiful cage she was desperate to escape. He was a man who understood cages. For 5 years his ranch had been his own, a cage of grief and silence built from memory and dust. The Arizona sun beat down, a merciless hammer in a sky of endless, unforgiving blue. This woman, a flicker of impossible white against the mesquite and creosote, didn't belong here. Nothing unexpected ever came to this corner of the world, and when it did, it was never good. He worked the first button free. The fabric parted, revealing a sliver of pale skin. He felt a jolt, a current of something he hadn't felt in years, something he'd thought long dead and buried with his wife. He told himself it was just the shock of it all. A woman in a wedding dress, barefoot and bleeding in the middle of nowhere. But as he freed the second button, he knew it was something else entirely. The skin wasn't smooth, it wasn't pale, it was a canvas of pure agony. Jagged, angry lines crisscrossed her back. Fresh whip marks. Some were still weeping, raw and crimson. Others had broken the skin, leaving open wounds that looked like they'd been carved with a hot knife. A low, guttural sound escaped Jackal's throat, a noise of pure, unadulterated shock. He froze, his hands hovering over the third button. This wasn't a runaway bride. This was a survivor. This was a woman who had clawed her way out of hell itself. The elegant white lace, a symbol of hope and new beginnings, now seemed like a grotesque mockery, highlighting the violence that had been inflicted upon her. His weariness vanished, burned away by a cold, simmering rage. Without another word, he finished the buttons. The dress pooled around her waist in a crumpled heap of ruined dreams. He pulled the faded cotton shirt from his own back, the fabric still warm, and draped it gently over her trembling shoulders. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but steady as a rock. He offered her his canteen, and she drank like a woman who had forgotten the taste of water. Her eyes, wide with a terror that seemed bottomless, finally focused on his. "I was a mail-order bride," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "His name. His name is Charles Whitford." The name hit Jackal like a physical blow, a ghost from a past he had tried to bury deep in the Arizona dirt. He knew that name. He knew the evil that came with it. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not just trouble that had found him. It was a reckoning. The silence in the small cabin was a living thing. For 4 days it had wrapped around them, a fragile truce between two strangers, bound by violence. Evelyn, as he now knew her name was, moved like a ghost, her eyes still holding the shadows of what she'd endured. Jackal watched her, his own ghosts stirring in the corners of the room. The name Charles Whitford was an unexploded bomb between them. By the flickering firelight on the fourth night, Evelyn finally found her voice. "He ordered me from a catalogue," she began, her words barely a whisper. "Like a new saddle or a bolt of cloth." Jackal sat opposite, cleaning his Winchester, the rhythmic click and slide of the mechanism the only sound in the room. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was listening to every word. "When I arrived at his ranch, it wasn't a home. It was a fortress." And he looked at me. He looked at me like I was livestock he'd just purchased. She hugged herself, the oversized shirt, a flimsy armor against the cold memory. "That first night he showed me what he wanted. Not a wife. Property. He took what he wanted, and when I fought back, he called it defiance." Her breath hitched, a dry, painful sob. "The next morning he had his man, a brute named Benton Miles, hold me down. Charles. He used the whip himself. He said I needed to learn my place before the wedding." She trailed off, the exhaustion of the memory weighing her down. The wedding was supposed to be the next day, a party to show off his new acquisition. I waited until they were all drinking. I just ran. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my feet were bleeding. I ran until I saw your fence. Jackal finished with the rifle and set it down carefully. He looked at the fire, the flames dancing in his dark, haunted eyes. The silence stretched, and for a moment Evelyn thought he wouldn't speak at all. Then his voice came out, a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. "It wasn't just you," he said. Evelyn stared at him, confused. "What?" "5 years ago," Jackal said, his gaze still fixed on the fire, as if seeing a scene play out in the flames. "My wife, Maria, she took a job as a housekeeper for a wealthy rancher new to the territory, a man who wanted to build an empire." He finally turned to look at her, and the grief in his eyes was so raw, so deep, it stole her breath. His name was Charles Whitford. The bomb had just exploded. This wasn't a random sanctuary she had stumbled upon. It was the one place on Earth where the hatred for Charles Whitford burned as hot as the Arizona sun. "He told everyone she ran off," Jackal continued, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Took some jewelry and disappeared. The sheriff looked into it, but Whitford owns the sheriff. He owns the whole damn town. I knew he was lying. Maria wouldn't have left. Not without a word." He picked up a piece of firewood and tossed it into the hearth, sending a shower of sparks into the air. "I could never prove it. It was my word against the most powerful man in the territory. After a while, I just gave up. I came out here to be left alone with her memory." He looked at Evelyn, at the whip marks hidden beneath his shirt, at the terror that still lingered in her eyes. "He didn't just hurt you, Evelyn. He's a monster who thinks he can take whatever he wants. And he just made the mistake of sending his latest victim to my door." A promise was made in that moment, unspoken but absolute. This was no longer just about protecting a stranger. This was about vengeance. The days that followed were a quiet hum of preparation. A storm was coming, and they both knew it. Jackal taught Evelyn how to use a shotgun, his large hands guiding hers, his voice calm and steady as he explained how to load, aim, and fire. The kick of the weapon against her shoulder was a shock at first, but with each blast that echoed across the ranch, a piece of her fear was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just a victim. She was becoming a warrior. They moved as one, a silent, efficient team. They reinforced the cabin doors, boarded up the smaller windows, and stockpiled water and ammunition. A profound, unspoken understanding grew between them. They were two broken souls finding strength in each other, their shared enemy forging a bond stronger than any vow. On the fifth night, the storm broke. The distant thud of hooves and the rumble of carriage wheels cut through the night. It wasn't just one or two riders. It was an entourage. "He's here," Evelyn said, her hand instinctively going to the shotgun resting against the wall. Jackal nodded, grabbing his Winchester from its rack above the door. "He won't be expecting a fight," Jackal said, his voice a low growl. "He'll be expecting a scared old man and a terrified girl." They didn't wait in the cabin. They moved to the barn, the shadows their allies, the scent of hay and dust filling their lungs. They hid behind a large haystack, a perfect vantage point to the yard in front of the cabin. The carriage rolled to a stop, its polished wood gleaming in the moonlight. Charles Whitford stepped out, imperious and arrogant. Benton Miles was with him, a hulking shadow at his side. But they weren't alone. The sheriff, a man with a tin star and a weak chin, dismounted alongside them, his presence making the threat official. "Harry," Whitford's voice boomed across the yard, using a name Jackal hadn't heard in years. "I know you're in there. The sheriff and I have come for my wife. Don't make this difficult." Jackal remained silent, his rifle steady. He was waiting. Evelyn's heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it. the moment of truth. Whitford grew impatient. "Harry, by the authority of the law, I demand you release Evelyn Whitford to me. You are harboring a fugitive." The sheriff took a nervous step forward. "Jackal, it's the law. You have to—" He was cut off by Jackal's voice, cold and clear, echoing from the darkness of the barn. "You're a long way from your jurisdiction, Sheriff, and you're trespassing." Whitford laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "My jurisdiction is wherever my property is, and that girl is my property." He started toward the cabin, confident and swaggering. "Now send her out before I—" That's when Evelyn stepped out from behind the haystack. She moved into the faint moonlight, the shotgun held not with fear, but with an unnerving calm. Her eyes were fixed on Whitford, and they burned with a cold fire. Whitford stopped dead in his tracks, his arrogant smile faltering. He saw not the terrified girl he had brutalized, but a woman he didn't recognize, a woman holding his judgment in her hands. "I'm not your property, Charles," Evelyn said, her voice ringing out in the still night air. "And I'm not going anywhere." Whitford's shock quickly turned to rage. "You ungrateful little—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. A shot rang out, not from Evelyn's shotgun, but from Jackal's Winchester. The sheriff's hat flew from his head, landing in the dust a few feet away. The sheriff yelped and dove behind the carriage. Benton Miles froze, his hand hovering over his pistol. "The next one won't be a warning, Whitford," Jackal's voice promised from the shadows. "I know what you did to Maria." The name hung in the air, a ghost suddenly made real. Whitford's face went pale. The swagger, the arrogance, it all vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure animal panic. He had come for a runaway bride. He had not expected to be confronted by the husband of a woman he had murdered 5 years ago. He stared from the ghost in the barn to the angel of vengeance in front of him, and for the first time in his life, Charles Whitford felt the icy grip of fear. He had underestimated them both, and he knew with sickening certainty that this was a mistake that was going to cost him everything. Whitford stumbled back, his eyes wide, his mind racing. The name Maria had shattered his composure. This wasn't about a runaway bride anymore. This was about a ghost he thought was long buried. "This isn't over, Harry," he spat, trying to regain some semblance of control, his voice laced with a venom that didn't quite cover the tremor of fear. He motioned frantically to Benton and the terrified sheriff. "Let's go." They scrambled back into the carriage, whipping the horses into a frantic gallop, disappearing into the night like the cowards they were. The dust settled, and the silence that returned was different. It was the silence of a battle won, but not the war. Evelyn slowly lowered the shotgun, her arms trembling from the adrenaline. Jackal emerged from the barn, his face grim in the moonlight. "He's scared," Evelyn said, the realization dawning on her. "I saw it in his eyes. He's scared of you." Jackal reloaded his Winchester, the metallic click echoing in the yard. "He's not scared of me," he said, his voice low. "He's scared of the truth, and now he knows we have it." In that moment, a new dynamic was forged. They were no longer just protector and victim. They were partners, allies in a war against a man who thought he was a king. The days that followed were charged with a new kind of tension, not of fear, but of anticipation. They knew Whitford would be back. He couldn't afford to let them live, not with what they knew. The quiet domesticity of the ranch became a backdrop for their deepening bond. They spoke of Maria, Jackal sharing stories of the woman he had loved and lost, painting a portrait of a vibrant, strong-willed woman who would have despised a man like Whitford. Evelyn, in turn, began to open up about her life back east, a life of poverty and desperation that had led her to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride, a promise of a new beginning that had turned into a nightmare. In sharing their pasts, they began to build a future, a fragile hope taking root in the scorched earth of their shared trauma. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence between them, Evelyn looked at the man who had saved her. His face, etched with lines of grief and hardship, was the kindest face she had ever known. An impulse, born of gratitude and a feeling she couldn't yet name, rose within her. "Jack," she said, her voice soft, "your wife. Maria, what was she like?" He looked into the fire, a sad smile touching his lips. "She was like a desert wildflower," he said. "Tough and beautiful. She could find beauty anywhere. She came here from a small village in Mexico, looking for a better life. She wasn't afraid of anything." He paused, his expression hardening. "Except him. She told me Whitford's eyes were like a snake's, cold and empty. She was planning on leaving the job the week she disappeared." He looked at Evelyn, and she saw the guilt he carried. "I should have made her leave sooner. I should have listened." "It wasn't your fault," Evelyn whispered, her hand instinctively reaching out to cover his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle as he turned his hand over to clasp hers. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the current that had been building between them. It wasn't just a bond of shared survival anymore. It was something more. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken emotions. The nights were the worst, the close quarters amplifying the tension. They slept in separate bedrolls on opposite sides of the small room, but they were both acutely aware of the other's presence, of every breath, every rustle of the blankets. One night, a nightmare ripped Evelyn from her sleep. She sat bolt upright, a scream caught in her throat, the phantom sensation of the whip on her back still burning. She was gasping for air, her heart pounding. From the other side of the room, Jackal's voice cut through the darkness, low and steady. "You're all right, Evelyn. You're here. You're safe." He didn't move from his bedroll, didn't cross the space between them, but his voice was a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of her terror. She lay back down, her breathing slowly returning to normal, the sound of his steady presence a comforting anchor in the dark. But sleep wouldn't return. The silence stretched, filled with everything they couldn't say. Finally, Evelyn's voice, barely a whisper, broke the stillness. "Jack, I'm here. Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why are you risking everything for me?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was raw with a confession that had been buried for 5 long years. "Because when I look at you," he said, "I see a chance to get the justice I could never get for Maria. And because for the first time in 5 years, this house feels like a home again." The admission hung in the air, a breathtakingly honest declaration that changed everything. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about redemption. It was about life clawing its way back from the clutches of death. The next day, a rider appeared on the horizon. Not a posse, not a carriage, but a single small figure on a tired-looking horse. Jackal and Evelyn watched from the porch, their rifles ready. As the rider drew closer, Evelyn gasped. It was Gus Lane, the young, pale-faced boy who had been driving Whitford's carriage. He looked terrified, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. He pulled his horse to a stop in the yard, his hands trembling as he held the reins. "I had to come," he said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't. I can't be a part of it anymore." Jackal kept his rifle trained on the boy. "Part of what?" Gus swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Evelyn and Jackal. "He's not just going to come back with the sheriff," Gus said, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "He's hired killers, men from out of the territory. He's going to burn this place to the ground and kill everyone in it. He said he's going to wipe you off the map." But that wasn't the real secret. That wasn't the reason Gus had risked his life to ride out here. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. This belonged to my sister," he said, his voice breaking. He held it out to Evelyn. She was his mail-order bride. 2 years ago, he told everyone she died of a fever. Evelyn took the book, her hands trembling. It was a diary. Gus looked at Jackal, his young face a mask of grief and fury. He's done this before. 4 times. 4 women from back east. They're all buried out on the north edge of his property, in unmarked graves. My sister, Maria, 2 others. He keeps a record. The diary wasn't just a diary, it was a ledger of death. Charles Whitford wasn't just a brute, he was a serial killer. And they were holding the proof. The game had changed again. This wasn't about a standoff anymore. It was about exposing a monster and making sure he could never hurt anyone again. But to do that, they had to survive the night. Because the killers were already on their way. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of blood orange and bruised purple. It was a beautiful, terrifying omen. The killers were coming. Gus's confession had turned their sanctuary into a ticking time bomb. The diary in Evelyn's hands felt heavier than any shotgun. It was a testament to the forgotten women, a chorus of silent screams now demanding justice. They didn't have much time. "We can't stay here," Jackal said, his mind working quickly. "He knows this ranch. He'll use the terrain against us. We have to draw them away." His eyes scanned the horizon, settling on the rugged, rocky outcrops to the east, a maze of canyons and cliffs known as the Devil's Jaw. "There," he said. "It's treacherous ground. Easy to defend if you know it. We can make a stand there." Gus, pale but resolute, nodded. "I can help. I can lead them on a false trail, buy you some time." Evelyn looked at the boy, seeing the courage solidifying in his eyes. He was no longer just a scared kid. He was an avenger for his sister. "It's too dangerous, Gus," she said. "No," he insisted. "He took my sister. I owe her this. I owe them all this." The plan was desperate, a long shot forged in the dying light. Gus would ride south, creating a clear set of tracks for the killers to follow. Meanwhile, Jackal and Evelyn would gather what they could, ammunition, water, and the precious diary, and make for the Devil's Jaw. They moved with a desperate urgency, the silence of the cabin now filled with the hurried sounds of preparation. Jackal gave Gus a spare pistol. "Don't be a hero, kid. Just be fast. Once you've laid the trail, circle back and ride for Fort Grant. It's a 2-day ride. Find a U.S. Marshal. Don't trust anyone else. Show them this." He tore a single page from the diary, a page detailing the murder of Gus's sister, and handed it to the boy. "This will be enough to get their attention." They parted ways as darkness fell, 3 small figures against a vast, indifferent landscape. As Gus galloped south, Jackal and Evelyn slipped into the growing shadows, moving east. The trek to the Devil's Jaw was grueling. They moved under the cold light of the stars, the rocks tearing at their boots, the weight of their supplies and the gravity of their situation pressing down on them. Every sound, every gust of wind made them flinch. The killers were out there, hunting them. During a brief rest huddled behind a large boulder, Evelyn opened the diary. She read the entries aloud in a low whisper, the words of the forgotten women filling the cold night air. They wrote of hope, of dreams of a new life, and then of confusion, fear, and finally, of the dawning horror of the monster they had married. It was a litany of suffering that solidified their resolve into something unbreakable. This wasn't for Maria anymore. It was for all of them. They reached the Devil's Jaw just before dawn, finding a defensible position high up in the rocks, a small cave-like alcove that offered cover and a clear line of sight to the canyon below. They were exhausted, bruised, but they were ready. The sun rose and the waiting began. The hours crawled by. The silence of the canyon was absolute, a stark contrast to the storm raging in their hearts. They took turns on watch, the other catching moments of fitful, restless sleep. They shared a piece of dried jerky and a sip of water, their movements economical, their words few. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Now there was only survival. Late in the afternoon, they heard it. The faint sound of horses echoing through the canyon. They weren't coming from the south, where Gus had laid his false trail. They were coming from the west, from the direction of the ranch. The killers hadn't been fooled. There were 4 of them, hard-faced men with rifles held at the ready, moving with the practiced ease of predators. And leading them on a powerful black stallion was Charles Whitford himself. Benton Miles was at his side. Whitford wasn't content to let his hired guns do the work. He had come to watch. He had come to enjoy the kill. He wanted to see the hope die in their eyes, just as he had with all the others. "He found the tracks we left," Jackal murmured, his voice grim. "He's smarter than I gave him credit for." Whitford's party stopped at the mouth of the canyon, scanning the rocks. Whitford pointed up towards their general direction. He couldn't see them, but his instincts told him they were cornered. One of the hired guns dismounted, starting to climb the rocks, moving with a deadly, silent grace. The hunt had begun. The first shot came from Jackal's Winchester. It ricocheted off the rock face just inches from the climber's head, sending a shower of stone chips into his face. The man yelped and scrambled back down to the canyon floor. A volley of answering fire erupted from below, bullets whining and spitting against the rocks around their hiding spot. The siege had begun. They were trapped high in the devil's jaw, with a monster and his killers baying for their blood below. They had a defensible position and a limited supply of ammunition. Whitford had numbers, time, and a burning, sadistic need to see them dead. The odds were impossible, but as Jackal and Evelyn exchanged a look, their rifles held steady. There was no fear in their eyes. There was only the cold, hard certainty that Charles Whitford's list of victims ended here. One way or another, this canyon would be his final resting place. The canyon became their world, a claustrophobic arena of rock and sky. The sun beat down, turning their stone fortress into an oven. Whitford and his men were patient. They knew they had their prey trapped. They took pot shots, forcing Jackal and Evelyn to stay low, their bullets chipping away at the rock that served as their only shield. Thirst became their most immediate enemy. Their canteens were nearly empty, and the relentless sun baked the moisture from their bodies. "We have to conserve ammunition," Jackal said, his voice a dry rasp. "They want us to waste it. They'll wait for us to run out of bullets or water." The day bled into a long, tense night. The temperature dropped, but the cold offered little relief. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. They took turns sleeping, but it was impossible to truly rest. The killers below lit a small fire, their rough laughter and conversation drifting up on the still night air, a constant, taunting reminder of their presence. Under the cover of darkness, one of the hired guns tried to scale the cliffs again, this time from a different angle. Evelyn saw him first, a dark shape moving against the slightly less dark rock face. She didn't hesitate. She raised her shotgun, the blast echoing like a thunderclap through the canyon. A scream followed, then the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. One down. The men below unleashed a furious volley of fire, the bullets screaming over their heads. But they had sent their message. They were not helpless prey. They would fight for every inch, for every breath. The second day was a slow, agonizing torture. The water was gone. Their lips were cracked, their throats raw. They could see the heat shimmering off the canyon floor. Whitford knew he was winning. He shouted up at them, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, taunting them. "It's over, Harry. Your whore is going to die of thirst. Throw down your weapons. I might let you watch before I kill you." Jackal ignored him. his focus absolute, but Evelyn could see the strain on his face. They couldn't last another day. Desperation began to set in. "There's a way out," Jackal whispered, his eyes scanning the far wall of their alcove. "A small fissure. It's tight, but it might lead up to the rim. I explored these canyons years ago. It was a sliver of a chance, a path that could lead to freedom or a dead end. We wait until full dark," he said. "They'll be less watchful then. We have to try." As dusk began to settle, another sound reached them. Not the sound of horses from the canyon floor, but from the rim above. For a heart-stopping moment, they thought Whitford had sent men to circle around and trap them from above. Jackal raised his rifle, aiming at the edge of the cliff. Figures appeared against the twilight sky, but they weren't Whitford's men. They were wearing the blue uniforms of the U.S. Cavalry, and leading them was a man with a U.S. Marshal's star pinned to his chest. And beside him, pointing down into the canyon, was Gus. The boy had done it. He hadn't ridden for 2 days. He must have ridden all through the night, pushing his horse to its limit, a desperate, impossible ride for justice. Relief washed over Evelyn in a wave so powerful it almost buckled her knees. But the fight wasn't over. Down below, Whitford and his men heard the horses, too. They looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and panic. They were caught, trapped between the Avengers on the cliff above and the U.S. Marshal on the rim. Whitford's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. If he was going down, he was taking them with him. "Kill them!" he screamed at his remaining men. "Kill them now!" The final, desperate firefight began. Whitford and his men charged forward, firing wildly up at the alcove, no longer caring about their own safety, driven by their master's cornered rage. At the same time, the Marshal and his men began firing down from the rim. Jackal and Evelyn were caught in a deadly crossfire. Bullets whined and ricocheted from all directions. It was chaos. Jackal pushed Evelyn deeper into the alcove. "Stay down!" A bullet grazed his arm, and he grunted in pain but kept firing, providing cover. Evelyn watched in horror as Benton Miles, the hulking brute who had held her down, took a bullet from above and crumpled to the ground. Another hired gun fell, then the last. Now it was just Whitford. He stood alone on the canyon floor, a wild, cornered animal. He was hit, bleeding from a wound in his leg, but he was still standing, his pistol still in his hand. His hateful eyes found their hiding place. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Evelyn. Time seemed to slow down. Jackal was reloading. The Marshal was too far away. This was it. Evelyn stared down the barrel of the gun, her own shotgun empty. But she didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her eyes burning with all the pain he had inflicted, not just on her, but on all the women in the diary. In that final moment, Charles Whitford saw not fear, but judgment. A single shot rang out, not from Whitford's gun. He staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A dark stain spread across his chest. He looked down, then back up at Evelyn, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. He collapsed into the dust, his reign of terror finally over. Evelyn looked up at the rim. Standing there, the spent pistol still smoking in his hand, was Gus. The boy who had been too afraid to speak up had fired the shot that ended it all. Justice, delivered by the brother of one of his victims. The silence that fell over the canyon was absolute. It was over, truly over. As the Marshal and his men made their way down, Jackal slumped against the rock wall, clutching his bleeding arm, a weary but triumphant smile on his face. Evelyn rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her shirt to make a bandage. "It's done," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He reached up with his good hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "We did it," he said. "For Maria. For all of them." They found the unmarked graves, just where Gus said they would be. The diary was the only headstone those poor women would ever have, but their killer was dead, and their story was finally known. Back at the ranch, the silence was no longer one of grief or fear. It was a silence of peace. The cabin, once a place of refuge, was now truly a home. Jackal Hallie, the solitary rancher, and Evelyn, the mail-order bride who refused to be broken, had faced down a monster and won. They had found, in the ashes of their pasts, the seeds of a new future, a future built on courage, resilience, and a love forged in the fires of adversity. She was no longer a victim, a fugitive, or a piece of property. She was the master of her own life, a survivor who had not only reclaimed her freedom, but had brought justice to those who had been silenced. In the unforgiving heart of the West, where power so often meant the freedom to be cruel, their story became a quiet legend. A story of how two broken people found the strength in each other to face down an empire and win. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What is true justice? Is it a marshal's bullet and a proper burial? Or is it something more? Is it the courage of a young boy to ride for help, the strength of a woman to pick up a gun, or the resolve of a grieving man to finally stand and fight? The West was full of monsters like Charles Whitford, but it was also full of survivors like Evelyn and heroes like Jackal. What part of their incredible journey resonated with you the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're drawn to tales of untamed justice and the resilient spirit of the American frontier, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next story we uncover from the shadows of the past.